Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life. Thanks for joining us today for this Equipping the Saints webinar. Whether this is your first experience in a conversation with Bishop Rogness or you're a regular attender, we thank you for joining us. This is just a pause in our day for holy conversations about timely topics that help us walk together as disciples in Christ. So today we are joined by a wonderful group of panelists. Bishop Rogness will introduce our guests in just a minute and explain how our hour will work. But as ever during the webinar, feel free to write any questions in the chat area or comments that come to mind, and the panelists will address those as possible. Also note that we are recording this webinar today for those who are unable to make it, and if you want to revisit anything later on. Those are available on the Synod website at www.scsw-elca.org/webinars. So let's take a moment to take a deep breath and to remember whose we are with a word of prayer. Almighty God, we thank you for this day and we praise you for your goodness and generosity. You are the God of endurance and encouragement. Help us to not just persevere through this challenging time, but to thrive as holy communities that gather to glorify you in our plans and our actions. Guide our conversation today. Help us to ask questions that reveal your life-giving purposes for our creation, and enlighten us as disciples called to share in your mission for the world. As we prepare to elect leadership for our synod, we are grateful for the presence of our bishops who have joined us today to share their wisdom, their experience, their good humor, and their faith. Bless our time and our discernment so that together, by the power of your Spirit, we may lift one person to lead and walk with us in service to your holy name. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Bishop Rogness, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to do three things in a few opening comments. I'm going to tell you why I invited these three to be part of this conversation and what I told them their assignment was going to be, and then I will do a little bit of introduction of each of them. Essentially, why did I pick these three when there's a whole host of former bishops to pick from? And third, then, how are we going to use this time? How will we move ahead? So first, I want to read you the assignment. When I emailed, I first asked if they could do this, and then I gave them, I wrote an email, and this is the question I posed to them, and I asked them, think about this, and be ready to kick us off with 5 or 10 minutes of your own thoughts around this question. So this is what I wrote. And actually, I've asked Robin or Vicky to put it in the chat box so that you can see it, because it's a kind of a long thing. So this is what I wrote. We're praying for the tenure of the next bishop to be stable, healthy, and enlivening to all of us. So the question to them, what have you seen that goes into making for a strong ministry of a synod and its bishop? How would you advise us as rostered and congregational leaders to be helpful and supportive of making this next chapter of our life as healthy as it can be? So it's not just a sort of an abstract thing, tell us about your life as a bishop. This is really looking for gleaning some advice and some observations for them as to what is it that makes the ministry of a bishop and a synod together strong, and how can we participate in that? So that was the task I gave him. Now, why did I pick these three? Well, I figure when you're asking somebody for a favor, go to your oldest friends, which is what I did. They each have some credentials to bring. Each one of them has been a parish pastor, each one has been a synod bishop, and each one has parish pastor. Actually, Andrea's first parish was in this synod. She was to have been our keynote address at our May assembly that we had to cancel, but she was the first ordained woman to serve in this part of Wisconsin back before it was even the South Central Synod, when she came to Madison. Stan served in Minnesota. Mark served several parishes in the Minneapolis area. Then Stan became bishop in Southwest Minnesota, Andrea in South Dakota, and Mark in the St. Paul area synod. And then all of them had roles in church-wide leadership. Mark is presiding bishop. Stan is head of, was it division for ministry back then? The names changed so often it was hard to keep up. And Andrea directing the malaria campaign when she finished as synod. So, moreover, they've all understood sort of the culture of the Midwestern Lutheran Church, which is where we are and who we are. But as I said, the real reason is, if you're asking a favor, ask your old friends. I go back with all of these people. Mark and I grew up together in St. Anthony Park Lutheran Church in the neighborhood of St. Paul. We're third cousins. So we went to the same church and then served obviously together in the Conference of Bishops. Stan and I were in seminary together and guided canoe trips in the Boundary Waters in the summer. And Andrea and I both had our first calls back in the 70s in the old Southern Wisconsin district. So if you've known somebody for over 40 years, I figure they won't turn you down. So that's why the three of them are here. So here's how we'll do this time. I've invited them to share their thinking around this question that I posed. And when each of them has done that, I'll see if they want, I said to them, they know each other well enough that they can poke holes in the fluff that somebody else might have offered along the way. But they can talk with each other, but also inviting you to offer comments or questions in the chat room. And I'm sure we'll have no problem filling this time. So I asked, just before we started here, I asked who's going to go first. And Stan said probably we should go by wisdom, which would make him go first. Although he left unanswered, is that most or least was his criteria. Then it was to be humility, but we couldn't sort out that one either. And so we decided to go by who was elected first, and that would have been Stan Olson. So Stan, we'll start with you, and I'll leave Andrea and Mark guessing as to who I'm going to call on next. So Stan, thanks for being with us.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Good to be invited. I wouldn't ordinarily add anything to an introduction, but as I look at a number of familiar faces on the screen here, I think I should also mention that my last call was as president of Wartburg SEM, and you're well represented in this group today, and it's a delight. I've hung around for quite a while and tried to pay attention, and early on in my service as bishop, I was very impressed with the astonishing variety of bishops and the way they approached things, the way they did things, and the astonishing variety of the synods that they served. But I never actually asked your question, Mark. What did these things have in common? What were the traits? So that's been fun to think about. So I have four thoughts to share with you. If you asked me to do this tomorrow, it would probably be four different thoughts. But for today, four qualities that I think I have noticed in lively, faithful, healthy synods and bishops and the partnerships among them all. Piety, stewardship, integrity, and teamwork. And these four clearly overlap and are interwoven. Piety, that's an old word, one we probably don't use very much anymore, but I think it's still a helpful one for when we're trying to talk about what is perhaps obvious. And if we want to talk about healthy, stable, enlivening relationships, I think we have to be aware of what's obvious along with everything else. The continuity of the faith that piety holds up and the life of faith. it makes a difference that we believe. It impacts who we are, what we do. The bishops and synods that are doing well, I think, are consistently mission-minded. I'm almost tempted to say invisibly, unconsciously mission-minded, because it doesn't necessarily get talked about, but I think it's really critical. I inherited a mission statement when I was elected in Southwest Minnesota, mission statement for the synod that I really liked, and there were parts of it that I quoted with regularity to myself, but also when I was out and about, that just kept reminding me of what we were doing. One of the lines was, "By the grace of God, together we have what we need." Still true. In the services of installation, we use in a variety of places. I think it's also in the confirmation service. There's a question asked, "Will you?" And then the response is either yes, we will, or we will by the help of God, or I will by the help of God. And that by the help of God thing that follows through for all of us all the time, I think is really a quality to remember. What does piety mean? The faith and the customs, the teachings, the traditions of the church are respected, and they are practiced, and they evolve. It doesn't mean just sticking with the old things, but there's an essential respect and a desire to practice. One of the things that I think I see that I would label as piety is a shared sense of wonder at God's working. Just sort of amazement, and I see it by storytelling. Bishops that tell stories about how God is working in their synods, congregations that tell their own stories, people that are talking about what God is doing in a synod and beyond the synod. The bishop is one of the chief storytellers of the synod, but an effective bishop, a healthy bishop, is also listening to stories throughout the synod. Prayer is a part of piety. I'm not going to say much about my own style of being bishop, but this time I will. One of the things that I really came to appreciate as I traveled around a largely rural district, lots of time in the car, I would pray for each parish that I knew I was close to. And especially on Sunday mornings when I was headed out someplace to preach, it was a source of great strength to remember that I was being prayed for. Peter, you asked what helps keep a synod strong. I encourage you to pray for your bishop by name, for other members of the synod staff, for your neighboring congregations, for the presiding bishop. Don't always use the same language, it'll become ritual, but to be in prayer for one another, as you can be confident that your bishop is in prayer for you. So piety, stewardship of the faith, stewardship of the mission of Christ, stewardship of the institutions. This is a commitment and a continuing habit among the many, many fine bishops and effective synods that I've seen over the years. Matthew 13, Jesus says, "Every scribe trained for the reign of God, for the reign of God, is like the master of a household who brings out of the treasure what is new and what is old." Tradition and innovation in constant interaction. This attitude of innovative stewardship is evident in the bishop, in his or her staff, in congregations, and in the communal life of the synod. People can assume in a healthy synod that it's going to be okay to value the tradition and to propose some changes. And it's both all the time, really. I have often said, long before I served in the office of the bishop, that I have a lover's quarrel with the church, with the institutional church. This matter of stewarding the institutions, of caring about them, of piety. It doesn't mean you have to like everything, but there is an essential love, a desire to have for the best in the other, including when the love is of an institution. So piety, stewardship, integrity. Integrity for the sake of the work. Integrity for the sake of the gospel. And integrity is the bishop in her or his person, the bishop's staff, rostered leaders, congregations, individual members of congregations, the synod as a whole, to be trustworthy and to be trusting, dependable in the best sense of the word, even predictable. To have somebody, I've had people do this, sit down in my office and say, now I know what you're going to say, Bishop. That's essentially a good thing, that people have a pretty good idea what your consistency is going to be. Or I can talk to a pastor that I've gotten to know and have some sense of what she or he is going to say, or a congregation. This is one of their strengths, and that's going to come up. There are mutual expectations of accountability, and there are systems in place, there's guidance in place, and these systems, these expectations are respected and they are used. But in a healthy situation, it's probably pretty low key most of the time. That of course we challenge one another once in a while. Of course we expect each other to be people of integrity. Faithfulness to the gospel, budgeting, conduct, dealing with misconduct. You all know, Peter, you talked about this in some of the material you sent to us that you had used in St. Paul. It's that dealing with misconduct is one of the most difficult aspects of the office of bishop and of the relationship with the church. And you folks have dealt with it in both directions. I always found it helpful to be very explicit in thinking, okay, I'm going out to talk to this pastor or this congregation, or they're coming in to talk to me for the sake of the gospel, to remove obstacles from the free course of the gospel in this fallen world, troubled church where God's grace is still active. Part of integrity is communication, candor, honesty. You nurture it by regularly being in contact in all these connections back and forth, bishop to staff, congregations, leaders, pastors, deacons, other staff, among the synod staff. Effective communication is an important aspect of integrity. So piety, stewardship, integrity, and teamwork. Teamwork when viewed from all kinds of different angles. The bishop and the congregations, the bishop and the congregational leaders, bishop and pastors and deacons and bishops together. Sometimes I've tried to think of myself as a player coach. Find some imagery for what do you think the bishop is? The word means overseer in its most basic root, but there's a lot more to it than that. With the recent death of Peter Stanke, I'm reminded to think about systems and the assumptions that we make, how this team is going to work is really important. Bishop and synod staff, shared responsibility. I inherited the assumption that if you had talked to one member of the synod staff, bishop or assistant, you had talked to all of us. We shared information. There was also delegated responsibility. There's a team there. And then there's a team when you look at the whole synod. You're electing, calling a person who can and will be a servant leader for a team and for that whole synod team. That can happen right away, and it will almost certainly grow and change and develop. Piety, stewardship, integrity, teamwork, mute.
Thank you, Stan. I don't think we ever did figure out who was elected first between I thought I would have guessed Andrea in 94 and Mark in 95, but I might have something wrong, but we'll go with Andrea anyway. That's going from, I apologize, Stan, I was going to point out the Wartburg connection because that certainly is felt around here. So we'll go to the other bishop, to the bishop who's a Wartburg graduate, actually, Andrea Hesdow.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks to all of you for sitting in on this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. I want to say a special word of greeting to our former colleague, George Carlson, who I saw on the screen up there as I scrolled across. It's good to see you again, George, and kind of virtually be in your old territory. So Stan had 4 things, and I have 3. Maybe Mark will have it nailed down to just 2 things. But here's my list of the ingredients for a strong ministry between bishop and people. The first one I make note of is receptivity to change, and that goes all the way around the table as far as whether bishop or synod clergy or other roster leaders or the people of congregations. There's a sense of epitha, being open to the new person, and the new person being open to being in a new role if they're a person from that territory. But in my case, I wasn't. So everything was new. I had seen Mount Rushmore. That was about the extent of my knowledge of South Dakota there when I was elected. And it was in 95. I think actually Mark was elected a week before me, but he'll correct that when it's his turn. So resistance to change, to openness, takes a lot of energy, and it takes away focus on how we want to move forward. And there is momentum following election. You want to try to capitalize on that, try to go with that, because there's a lot of pent-up enthusiasm and interest in the choosing of a new bishop. So it's good to have something that will help you stay open to that newness past the days in former COVID time, before COVID, the days of an assembly. Obviously, there's a mission to embrace there. There's a biblical understanding of who we are as God's people and how we're moving in this time and place into God's preferred future for us. And there's the ability to articulate a mission, to keep our eyes on the prize, so that in the midst of all the transition that does come with being a new leader, a new territory, and certainly in this context and time, especially so many other pieces are in flux, we want to be able to keep a clear sense of what that mission is. Stan really articulated that well. One of my favorite mission statement pieces from a congregation here in South Dakota back many years ago, they had the nice, love everybody and are called out of baptism to serve everyone. It was really nice, good things to say in a mission statement. But the final one was, we want to go to where God is. And right now, in this time, it doesn't seem so dramatic of a statement to make, to be beyond the walls of the church, to be beyond our comfort zone and our familiarity. But at that point, and for that congregation, that was a really important piece to have in their mission. And I've always liked citing it and using it. None of this belongs, as I said at the outset, to receptivity to change isn't only for the people getting used to a new bishop. It is definitely all the way around the table. The second one was attention to relationships. I like to say, I will be your bishop, you will be my people. That there's heart in what we do in this office, even though at times, especially in times of discipline and difficulty, people question where the heart is. There's a lot of heart in this office and in this work. In Western North Dakota, where I had served prior to being elected here in South Dakota, we had a phrase called do the chores. So it had a real good agriculture base, you know, every day, no matter what else you were going to do. If you were in agriculture and had livestock, you had chores to do. And there was a sense about that with the work of the synod or with the work of a congregation. Take care of the main things, and that helps build trust among the people that you are in fact responsible, that you can carry the weight of this office and the management of it. And there's a sort of humanness, day-to-dayness about that piece. And then to be surrounded with capable leaders who are engaging their roles, who aren't trying to be the bishop any more than you were trying to be the pastor of their church, or to be the leader in their setting, but they engage the roles they have as well. So the third thing, and then I'll be done, is as an ingredient for a strong ministry, to see the world. And I don't mean necessarily getting in a plane and going somewhere else in our global mission field. But visit people, get out of the office, get out of the places that are so expected for you as a bishop and a leader to be seen. I think we know this in parish ministry, how valuable it is to be at events in the community, to see people in their workplace, to show up in different places and in different contexts. The old Rodgers and Hammerstein musical used to say, you got to know the territory. So you got to get out there. And the thing that gives you, that gives me, is that you get a perspective, because it's a bigger picture. And it's a map that people help you draw. A good friend of mine gave me a map when I was first elected in South Dakota of all the towns that had Dairy Queens. So he thought that would be essential information for me to know as I started traveling around South Dakota. And indeed, it was a very helpful map to know about, to have. But there's a playfulness in hearing people's story about their setting, and walking the land with them and walking the blocks of Main Street in, whatever context it is. You see the uniqueness of the here that people come from and of the there that they assume about where you're from. So there's dialogue in that. You want to see the world and know the territory, receive the prayers and support, as Stan certainly mentioned too, and that you get to ask good open-ended questions, that you are in that moment, in that seeing the world, gaining perspective, but you're also hearing stories and receiving information that is really critical for who you can be as a leader and how far we can go together as people. That's what I got.
Great. Good, thank you. Good stuff. Mark, I hope you're not feeling like you're in the position of the seventh word on the seven last words, where the other six all said something. I figure you can come up with something new. But
I'm more with the gospel writers that had to keep telling the story over and over again. So
there you go. There you go.
Thanks to each one of you for the way you're carrying out your both rostered and lay callings in specialized settings, in congregational settings. It's a daunting thing to think about how you are adapting to this coronavirus world and all the changes. And I have such gratitude and respect for you and the way you're living out your baptismal callings in daily life. Well, I'm back to 4 insights that I would draw, but I again say that adapting these to the context in which ministry, synodical and local, is happening these days will take all the imagination and creativity of which both Andrea and Stan have talked. So number 1 is commit yourself as a synod. It may be your practice now, and if it is not, make it, of gathering once a quarter as synod rostered leaders with your bishop, so the bishop can proclaim the gospel, preside at the table, and then following worship, lead you in a communal conversation about what it means to be serving the gospel in this particular context, in this particular time. That had not been the practice in St. Paul Synod when I was elected. It was the first thing I announced that we would do. I often tell the story of the therapist who stopped me in a family therapy session and said, Mark, this is probably not appropriate for me, a Catholic lay person, to ask you, a Lutheran bishop, but do you believe in the grace of God or don't you? He said, you spend so much time in these sessions dwelling on the things that you think you should have, wished you would have, maybe could be doing differently as partner with Ione and parent to your 6 children. And then he said, Mark, do you believe in the grace of God or don't you? And who proclaims God's word of forgiveness to you? And when it's spoken, do you even believe it? I have a hunch that I don't know all of you, but I think I know enough about us that we spend a lot of time dwelling on the things we think we should have, wished we would have, and maybe could be doing differently in our context of call and in our varied vocations. We need to gather so the bishop can, in the name of Jesus, proclaim God's word of forgiveness. So it is spoken to you who proclaim that word to others. Then the question remains, who will speak God's word of forgiveness to the bishop who proclaims it to you? And that question needs to be answered together with your bishop. Secondly, I would encourage, and to the extent that you can mandate, that your new bishop, in addition to being supported by the Synod Council, by Mutual Ministry Committee, by staff, by you, have 3 people in place in her life that will accompany her in this call. The first is that she, in your case, will have a spiritual friend. That's what Bill Smith called himself in my relationship with him, or spiritual director. Someone who doesn't care really about what's going on in the synod, but whose primary question to the bishop is going to be, as Bill Smith would ask me, no matter where I was in the world, Mark, how is it with your soul? You need a Jethro, as Jethro was to Moses. You recall when Moses was very busy doing all God's work and the crowds were all around him and he was intercessing in conflicts and he was praying. Jethro shows up and says, Moses, what you're doing is not a good thing. Who will be that person in your bishop's life? Because Jethro said, Moses, you're forgetting that God will distribute the gifts of leadership upon a whole community of people so that you can do what is core to your call, Moses, to lead. So may there be that kind of a spiritual friend accompanying your bishop. Secondly, I think every person should be in therapy. I've been in therapy both singularly alone and as a family for years and years and years. I need somebody that's going to keep me healthy. Healthy in myself, healthy in my relationships, healthy in my perspective on my life and future and gifts. And Ann Dillard said once, good leadership comes from people who have penetrated their own inner darkness, then can lead to a place of hidden wholeness because they've been there. And the third person to accompany this bishop would be somebody, and it's been alluded to already, trained in systems theory. And I think the Synod needs to pay for that person to be a consultant over the next 6 years, beginning with accompanying the bishop in how she gathers a staff. I'll never forget, I hadn't gotten off the stage when I was elected bishop, and I had 2 people come up on the stage and ask if they could be on my staff. You need somebody who's going to help the bishop think systematically in systems theory, because leading the church in an anxious time takes the wisdom and insight of a Peter Steinke from whom we all learn so much. So that's the second with 3 subpoints. The third is, and this is more speaking to whomever you call as bishop, to ask the question right away, how will I choose to show up in this synod and where will I choose to show up first? Before I had even taken office, as both synod bishop and presiding bishop, I wrote a letter to the congregations and rostered leaders committing myself that in the first 2 years of my ministry, I would be present in every congregation and to the degree possible, every specialized ministry setting possible. That means me collectively with my staff, and not just on a Sunday morning, but committed to being present during the week, sitting with each rostered person alone in their office. And I can't tell you how many rostered leaders wept saying, this is the first time a bishop has come to pray with me. And then meeting with the staff, and then meeting with the congregational council. And then on Sunday, proclaiming the gospel, or the Scandinavian tradition is the bishop comes and listens to the pastor preach, and then gather the congregation around a meal, celebrating their ministry there locally and interpreting the ministry beyond that local context synodically, churchwide, and globally. When you commit yourself to that process of 2 years, you are saying to the synod, I'm not going to be defined by conflicts. I will help find resources to resolve conflicts. I will tend to the tasks in those multiple descriptions of the synodical bishop's responsibilities, but I want to shape them around the priority of being present with you in your context of ministry. Well, fourth, I think stability is a laudable goal, and I know something about what you've been through as a synod. I was there the morning after Bruce Burnside's accident and spent a lot of time with you in those weeks and months. I've followed what has happened since. I know something before. Stability and health are wonderful attributes, but I think they need to be framed more broadly. And for me, I have often turned to the ELCA social statement, God's Peace for the World, to frame what it means to be engaged in vibrant ministry today. And in that social statement, we say, we are called to be 4 ways of being present in the world. And the task is what's being called for in this moment. We say we are called to be a disturbing presence. Secondly, we're called to be a reconciling presence. Third, we're called to be a serving presence. And fourth, we're called to be a deliberating presence. I encourage you to go back to that social statement and read how we unpack what those words mean, because I think we immediately put our content into those words. And the content of the social statement is rich, contextual, and prophetic. And to me, a healthy, stable, vibrant, enlivened synod will be one where you are coming together with your bishop to say what's being called for from us in this moment. Is it to be a disturbing present, a reconciling present, a serving present, or a deliberating present? It may be varied in each context. So 4 ideas that in this context may contribute something to being a stable, healthy, enlivened synod. The PS I would ask you to contemplate is, what will bring joy to the bishop, to your relationship with the bishop, to you in ministry? Because I think we talk too little about the experience of joy in serving the gospel. Jesus concluded his farewell discourse to his disciples, you remember, by summarizing, all this that I have said to you is for one purpose, so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. I got a lot of sympathy, as I'm sure Andrea and Stan did too, for what it must be like to serve in the office of bishop. And I often said, I have never experienced such joy serving the gospel as I have in the office of bishop, serving the gospel synodically and in churchwide ministries. And I trust the one that you call will say the same thing. And that will be the surest sign of health and vitality and an enlivened call. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks to all 3 of you. Let's see. First, let me give first chance to the 3 of them who have just spoken. I know what it's like, so do most of you who are watching this, to be a preacher who's sitting and you listen to someone else preach and you think, well, that's good. Now I would have said it this way, or that triggers in me another thought, or whatever. So any comments or observations any of the three of you want to make about something that one of the other two has said?
Well, I'll jump in just to go back to Stan, because you talked about trustworthy, Stan. And I remember when I became a synod bishop, someone said to me, when you were called to a parish, trust was given and assumed until you proved to be untrustworthy. Now you're in an office where it is not assumed, but you will have to earn it every day. How do you see the interplay between, and both of you answer this, between trust given to the one who is called to this office or trust having to be earned? And what determines that kind of cautions us about giving trust and putting us in a posture of, wait a minute, you have to earn my trust?
Stan or Andrea?
Interesting question, Mark. I guess my experience was the same in the congregation as in the synod, that I walked into people assuming I was trustworthy, being willing to work with me, but then I had to continue to earn it. And I had the same thoughts about the people of the synod, but we didn't come out of any turmoil. There hadn't been difficulties. I was thinking as you were talking, it's probably important to pivot pretty quickly to the present and the future in these offices. That's probably especially true for South Central Wisconsin right now, that you not let any anxiety about the past. That's part of the reality of forgiveness is that we can let go. We have the real chance for a fresh start. There are always suspicions of leaders. I used to talk about this suspicion. People are suspicious of big business, big school districts, and big church. And to some extent, one represents big church when you're a bishop. I did have a sub point here that I didn't use about watch your language. To help for the synod to be supportive, for each leader in the synod to think about, how do we talk about the synod? When do we call on the synod? How do we always be sure that the synod is us in the language, so that we build trust together by our assumptions, by our language? Andrea.
I don't think I experienced the entry as a high trust time in my experience as bishop. I was an unexpected election as a woman, and though it made a lot of people very happy and eventually made me very happy, Mark is right about that. It's a great honor and privilege, and there's a lot of joy. There wasn't so much for me on the day of election. And I know a lot of other people felt the same way. I received a note from a man just hours after the election had been announced saying, I can't believe this has happened. I don't know how I'm going to go home and explain this to anybody. I don't know how you can make it any better. So I think there was in those years, that was 1995, praise God, the church has moved in many ways, but there was a real need to prove capability, that you could listen, that you could do the chores, you knew what to do. And of course, I didn't. I was really hoping I would know what to do. So anyway, that process of becoming trustworthy in their eyes is undergirded with that transparency and being open, claiming no particular trustworthiness other than what you can prove and what you have built yourself to at that point. I think that's important. I wanted to jump on something Mark said as well, as long as I'm not muted right now. So that was about the stability and health thing. You know, I stumbled over that in Peter's question as well and thought similarly, those are wonderful things to aspire to. But there is also a point where you need to do that trust piece that says that will come, that will be here. We will build that again and feel that sense again. It is something that you establish, I believe, in hindsight, that you've done a good job at building the house, and so it stands firm. But I'm not so sure that it takes you forward. And that a commitment, Mark's example of the social statement is a great one to pick up on. A commitment to go forward, that this is who we are. And we are going forward is critical.
Let me hone a question a little, since I see no one has jumped into the chat room yet. I will. What occurs to me when you talk about how do you build trust, what do you first come into? How does a synod receive someone who's coming into this office fresh? All of us being elected when we were and serving when we were, we served during times of great tension within the church over primarily first the ecumenical stuff and the sexuality stuff. All of us were in synods where those were hot, both and very divisive, and people ready to leave the church, and people looking real hard at who this bishop is and what this bishop is saying and so on. I think it's a fair observation to say nowadays, we don't have quite the same hot button issues tearing us apart within the church, except that the church is very much affected by the increasing tribalism, the polarity, distrust that's rampant within the whole culture right now. What have you learned about serving as a bishop in a time of wariness over where you stand that could serve a bishop well in these polarized times? This synod, no surprise, this synod would have plenty of people in each of the tribes that are around the culture. Most of our synods do, I think. So what thoughts might you have about ministering well in this cultural time?
Well, I think the bishop needs to decide his or her role in those conversations. Is it to be one voice, a prophetic voice alongside others? Or is it to be one that's presiding over a body in deliberation about how it speaks collectively? Or is it to convene people to share their positions in an environment of trust that doesn't need to come to resolution about one stance together? But when I was presiding bishop, I got a lot of criticism from people who thought I should have taken a more definitive stand, for instance, on the 2009 decisions. I knew that I couldn't preside over an anxious system engaged in a difficult conversation and at the same time take a personal public position about how I thought the church should have moved forward. And now, especially with a new bishop coming out into office after the November elections, which may be done by March, I think how we lead together and live together as church and how we engage in moral deliberation. I go back to that fourth item in the social statement. I don't think we do ourselves a service when everything becomes in its polarity. I'm learning from my young adult children, Dad, just get rid of your either or way of looking at the world. I say, well, Lutherans always have. We say both and. But I think we have a different way to approach complex issues now, hopefully, that won't be defined so dramatically by where you stand in relationship to this presidency, for instance, or this election. And that's the way we do social statements acknowledges the complexity of ethical questions. And so we take time and we go into our theology and our scriptures, and we listen to the experts in the field, and we value personal opinions, and then we try to find a collective voice, knowing that voice will inform us, but it won't bind our conscience.
We are starting to get a few a few comments, questions in the chat room. How much have you experienced the influence of power and money as an attempt to direct your office as bishop, rising out of reading the book One Nation Under God: How Corporate America Invented Christian America? Anybody want to take? How has any reflections on the influence of power and money on the office of bishop? I don't know that I'm aware that any of you went out and bought a big yacht after leaving office, so maybe it didn't work.
I do think, and from a synod standpoint, I might try to weigh in on that a little bit, that it isn't so much the individual donor as you might think of in your congregation, a wealthy family, and them deciding to leave would make a immediate impact economically. We did have some conversations with larger churches, some of whom were very generous with what they gave to the synod, and therefore what we could give to churchwide to flow through. And that's an important relationship to have. That's all. I mean, that was what I felt was that I had the power to do, was have a relationship that could clearly articulate what I believed our churchwide expression was doing, and where we fit into that as part of our synod, or where our synod was moving in a way that was, I have a real rural and sort of South Dakota urban split here. I always have the larger churches and the smaller churches. So to try to be some kind of a seamstress of a fabric that wove those two together and helped them see common dynamics. And that had to do with money on both sides. It had to do with money as power. Certainly in the controversies of the church, there were lots of threats. Personally, I had threats about if you don't say or do this, you know, you're not going to have your job, meaning it wouldn't be elected again. I thought, well, there's a threat. Yeah. That it just didn't seem to hold much water. I mean, clearly you can not elect me again at your pleasure. But at this point, this is a call, and I'm bound by this. So I don't know if that hangs together.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks for that. Let's see if we can get a couple more in. They are, as is typical, starting to come in again right towards the end. Jack Way observes that asks any advice for how a new bishop and a synod develop a new relationship together, as the candidates have each been formed within other synods. Interesting that none of them are lifelong ministers of this synod. Some two rostered within the synod, two not, but all formed according to this terminology. And I think each of you would have started ministry in a place other than where you served as synod bishop. Andrea, you already made reference to coming in stone cold to South Dakota. Mark from across the river, which is quite a different synod. Observations about how you start fresh when there isn't already deep roots in the life of a synod. Mark spoke to that in some of your comments starting off.
I'd echo Mark too about in that situation, plenty of opportunity for listening, intentional, be out, I'll be around, let's do this, you know, in a way that is workable to establish a pattern of listening and sharing what you're hearing so that it can be a conversation one way or another. different synods are different, no question about it. But we are all part of the. We've been part of the same church. So
I think it's important that the new bishop be in as many conversations as possible where you are invited to name your expectations for this ministry. I saw cross-stitched on a pastor's wall in Florida this statement: unspoken expectations are resentments in waiting. And I think we all begin relationships and calls with expectations. I don't think pastors sit often enough with the council when they begin a call saying, let's name our expectations for this shared ministry upon which we're embarking. I don't think that happens synodically or church-wide. And to the degree to which we don't name our expectations, but they always exist, then we set ourselves up for the potentiality of resentment. And I don't know about you, but in my life, resentment is a toxic emotion. It's just plain toxic. So I think the more, it's not just getting acquainted, it's being truthful that we hold expectations. And then your new bishop can own some of those, or maybe say, you know what? I don't think I'm going to fulfill that expectation, but let's figure out together who can.
I think that's really critical, a process of talking about the future together in which that should be the focus, in my opinion, is our future. You know, we walk through this present time into that future, and what are the undergirdings biblically, theologically, but also in that process, you're going to hear about the past, and that becomes a laying down and an honoring. You don't have to fix that. You do want and need to hear it. It's like a new person coming on staff, and you've been in those situations as well. Your observations and what you see and experience are so valuable because everybody else is used to it. So you see things that others don't. And it doesn't mean that what you see needs to be what happens, but it does give opportunity for lifting up some things we've taken for granted and ways we've done our work that are patterned. So don't underestimate, as you come in from a different synod, the benefit of seeing new things that people don't see anymore.
Thanks. Thank you. Let me make one. I see we're just about out of time. I do want to make one comment that is directly related to this. How do you launch relationships? Mark talked a lot at the very beginning about the kind of giving priority to the sort of visitation. I guess all three of you did, and I certainly would too. But I'd also make this observation, and it's a kind of a plea for understanding throughout the synod. When I started here at the end of September last year, one of the first things that I gave priority to was figuring out how to be in every one of the 12 conferences personally, meeting with the rostered leaders, a morning or an afternoon or so. That time together was just marvelous. And I said, and I told myself, boy, whoever gets elected, I'll tell them to do that same thing. That was, and all of you have been saying that. And now for the last 5 months, we haven't been able to do any of that. And the new bishop who comes in won't be able to do any of that. And my observation about Zoom is it's a very effective and a very effective medium for communication, primarily with people with whom you already have a relationship. It's a lot tougher to use this as the medium that you build relationships from the ground up, but that's all this new bishop is going to have to work with for at least the first months, and who knows, maybe the first year or two. So I think, Mark, when you talked about unstated expectations, elevating an expectation too high about, boy, this bishop needs to connect with us all. Connection building is tough in the COVID era that we're living in. And I think we can presume any bishop who comes in is going to give that really high priority, but be operating with really tough circumstances up against odds for this time. Well, we could talk about that and a whole lot of other things along the way, but we are at 3 o'clock, 1 minute after. And as I mentioned, we try and observe that pretty carefully. I know that Vicki wants to make an announcement or two about urging people now, because we've got 4 days left to be registered for the Synod Assembly. Any quick 30-second comments from Mark, Andrea, or Stan?
Just to thank you for the privilege, and know that I and the other two I know will be in prayer for your whole process. And it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces from all aspects of my years in this.
Yeah.
I
No,
should echo that. I get to start being a bishop again in September. So I've taken good notes, Mark and Stan and Peter, and will rely on you as I always have.
Where are you going to be?
Andrea is referring to the fact she's going to be the interim bishop over in Northeast Iowa, just across the border from this synod.
Wow.
Yeah. Bishop Olmsted retires the end of this month, and they have postponed their assembly to elect until June of next year, 21. So.
Well, that's great for the church and you.
Thank you. Well,
thanks for this invitation. It was wonderful.
Yep.
Thanks again to all of you. Vicki.
Well, thank you. Yes, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. As Bishop Rogness pointed out, Friday midnight is our deadline for registering for Synod Assembly. So get your people registered. If you have any questions about what they need to do or need to have, feel free to give me a call at the Synod office, and I'll be happy to work with anyone. Next week will be our last webinar conversation with Bishop Rogness before Synod Assembly. We will not hold one on August 25th, as we'll be focusing on Synod Assembly. And then I think, Bishop, you have one more in September, I think you're going to be doing, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Correct. Another date to put on your calendar, if you haven't yet, is this coming Monday, August 17th. We'll be holding a hearing on the 2021 spending plan and compensation guidelines. This will be an interactive webinar with our Synod Vice President, Jane Cahill-Wolfgram, our Treasurer, Bruce Hutler, and our Assistant to Bishop for Leadership Support, Reverend Steve Kotke. So send your voting members and become familiar with these two important items that we will be voting on at Synod Assembly. Get those questions answered. Participating in the hearing will help us to move the vote more efficiently on the 29th. So the link was provided in What Matters. If you're currently not receiving What Matters, send me an email and I will be happy to add you to the distribution. And I'll type my email in the chat area here. Bishop Peter, any final comments?
No, other thanks to all of you for participating. I say it every week, I enjoy this. I more than enjoy it. I find it enlivening and an important part of my week every week. So thanks again for tuning in. And
Thanks,
once again,
everyone.
Thanks, Mark, Andrea, Stan. It was great seeing you all again.
Thanks, everyone, for attending this Equipping the Saints webinar. It's always better with you here. Go in peace.